the new space race, is driven by national security, economic interests, and geopolitical rivalries. Today's key themes include militarization of space, economic competition, private sector involvement, geopolitical alliances, potential for conflict. We discuss the urgent need for comprehensive international frameworks to govern space activities and maintain peace. Are you ready? Let's dive in.
All right, let's dive in. Today we're tackling the geopolitical implications of space exploration and resource extraction. You've given us some really interesting sources to work with.
Yeah, it's a fascinating topic, and it seems like we're way past just scientific curiosity these days.
Definitely. Space is becoming, well, kind of like a stage for global power plays and economic competition. Maybe even conflict.
Exactly. And that's the big question looming over all this, isn't it? Will space remain a place of, peaceful cooperation? Or are we on the brink of another space race, but this time with potentially, earth-shaking consequences?
No more just planting flags on the moon, huh? Sounds like things are heating up. But first, I gotta ask, how do we even get here?
Well, space has become a strategic domain. That's a huge shift from, say, just a few decades ago.
Okay, so it's strategic. What does that even mean in terms of, actual actions?
I think the creation of the U.S. Space Force back in 2019 was a pretty clear signal.
Huh.
Nations are recognizing space as this, critical area for national security and, potentially even military operations.
Okay, so the U.S. is taking it seriously. But what about other major players? Are they just watching from the sidelines?
Not at all. China and Russia are actively developing their own space capabilities, too. We're talking hunter-killer satellites. Satellites designed to take out other satellites.
Whoa, hold on. Satellites that can destroy other satellites. That sounds like something straight out of a sci-fi movie.
It might sound like science fiction, but it's very real. There are even specific examples that have raised eyebrows, like Russia's Cosmos 2576 satellite. Some experts believe it's one of those hunter-killer types.
So it's a bit of a space chess match, but with incredibly high stakes. What are they even trying to gain from controlling space?
Well, control of space translates to control over essential infrastructure. Think about it. Satellites are the backbone of so much. Communications, navigation, even intelligence gathering.
Right, we rely on satellites for pretty much everything these days, but there's got to be more to it than just strategic advantage.
Yeah. Oh, there's definitely more. We're also talking about access to potentially trillions of dollars worth of resources up there.
Trillions. Okay, now you've got my attention. What kind of resources are we talking about? Is it like diamonds on Neptune or something?
Not quite diamonds, but just as valuable, maybe even more so. There are two key things driving this new space race: rare earth metals and, believe it or not, water ice.
Water ice. I'm having a hard time picturing that as a hot commodity in space.
It's more valuable than you might think. That water ice can be split into hydrogen and oxygen. And guess what? Those are the main components of rocket fuel.
Oh, right. So you could essentially refuel spacecraft in orbit or even on the moon using water ice.
Yeah.
That changes everything.
Exactly. It could be a complete game changer for deep space exploration. And then you have the moon and asteroids, thought to be rich in rare earth metals like neodymium and yttrium, essential for all the electronics we use every day.
Okay, so water ice is space gasoline. And rare earth metals are, well, powering our smartphones and computers. No wonder everyone's trying to get a piece of the action. But it's not just governments vying for these resources, right?
Yeah.
What about all those private companies making headlines? Especially companies like SpaceX.
You're absolutely right. Companies like SpaceX are revolutionizing space travel. They've figured out how to drastically reduce launch costs. Reusable rockets, that's the key. And that opens up possibilities we could only dream of before.
Yeah, SpaceX and their Starship program. They're aiming for lunar and Martian colonization, aren't they? That's pretty ambitious.
Ambitious is an understatement. They're planning something like 25 test launches just this year for Starship. 25, that's an insane amount of activity.
25 launches in 1 year. Wow. I mean, with private companies like SpaceX making such huge leaps, is there a chance they could end up holding more power in space than governments?
It's a question worth considering. Their influence is growing rapidly. It also raises some interesting legal questions. Because with all this activity, who actually owns the rights to those resources in space?
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. We can't just have a free-for-all up there, can we? Someone's got to be in charge, right?
You'd think so, but the current legal framework for space is, well, a bit outdated and full of ambiguities.
Hmm.
We have the 1967 Outer Space Treaty, which prohibits nations from claiming ownership of celestial bodies. But it doesn't really say much about resource rights.
So it's like a cosmic gold rush with very few rules. That sounds like a recipe for disaster, or at least some serious disagreements.
You hit the nail on the head, and that's where things get even more complicated. The U.S. has been pushing for something called the Artemis Accords.
The Artemis Accords. Remind me what those are all about again.
They aim to, set some ground rules for lunar resource extraction and generally promote cooperation in space. But not everyone is thrilled about them.
Oh, really? Who's not happy with the Artemis Accords?
Well, China and Russia, for starters. They see it as, a U.S.-led attempt to basically dominate the moon and all its valuable resources. They're backing their own project called the International Lunar Research Station. Suggests they have a different vision for how things should play out.
So we've got competing visions for the future of space exploration. That sounds a lot like, well, history repeating itself. Especially when you think about the Cold War and the space race back then.
It's hard not to see the parallels. The current rivalry between the U.S. and China, especially when it comes to technology, is definitely a major factor here. China's been making incredible progress in space, and their alliance with Russia doesn't make things any less tense. It's seen as a direct challenge to U.S. dominance.
So we've got economic incentives, security concerns, and historical tensions all mixed together. Is it safe to say that the potential for conflict in space is, well, pretty high?
Honestly, it would be naive to think otherwise. And it's not just about nations going head-to-head either. There's the possibility of conflict between nations and private companies, or even between different private companies. It's a very complex situation.
Okay, so we have nations developing space weapons, private companies pushing the boundaries of what's possible, and a legal system that's struggling to keep up. It sounds like we're sitting on a cosmic powder keg.
That's a pretty accurate assessment. And to make matters worse, there's the ever-growing problem of space debris.
Right, space junk. I've read about that. Isn't it a major threat to current and future space missions?
It's a huge problem. We're talking about millions of pieces of debris, everything from old satellites to spent rocket parts, all zipping around Earth at incredibly high speeds. Even a tiny fragment can cause catastrophic damage to a spacecraft. And the more we launch, the worse it gets.
A chain reaction waiting to happen. One collision could lead to a cascade of debris, basically creating a no-go zone in space.
That's the fear. And here's the thing. All of this underscores just how important international cooperation is. If we're not careful, we could end up ruining space for everyone.
It's bigger than just who gets to mine the moon or build the fanciest space station. It's about the future of space exploration itself.
Exactly. We need to move from competition to collaboration if we want to ensure a future where space remains accessible and beneficial for all of humanity.
So what does all of this mean for, well, the average person who isn't a rocket scientist but still cares about what's happening in the world? Why should they care about this new space race?
Because what happens in space doesn't stay in space. Think about it. The satellites we depend on for communication, navigation, even banking, are becoming increasingly vulnerable. A conflict in space, even a small one, could disrupt those systems and have a ripple effect on everyone on Earth.
A cosmic domino effect, basically.
Right. Precisely. And beyond those immediate practical implications, there's a bigger, almost philosophical question here. Are we going to take our conflicts and rivalries from Earth and just, splat them all over the cosmos? Or can we find a way to cooperate and ensure that space remains a place of peaceful exploration and discovery?
That's a profound question. And it seems like the answer will shape the future, not just for space exploration, but for all of us here on Earth as well. But before we dive into those even bigger questions, let's take a closer look at some of the key players in this new space race. We've talked about SpaceX, but there's a whole universe of private companies out there.
Absolutely. We've got Blue Origin, founded by Jeff Bezos, who's got this vision of space tourism for everyone. And then there's Planetary Resources, focused on developing technology for asteroid mining, trying to tap into that vast mineral wealth out there.
So many different players with different goals. It's like a whole new frontier of entrepreneurship and innovation. But with that comes a whole new set of challenges and questions, right?
Right. The rise of these private companies is really shaking things up, creating opportunities, but also raising a lot of questions about how we manage this new era of space exploration.
This is also fascinating It really feels like we're at a pivotal moment where the decisions we make about space today will have consequences for generations to come. And that's a great place to take a pause. We'll be back in a moment to continue our exploration of the geopolitical implications of space exploration and resource extraction. Welcome back to our deep dive into the geopolitical side of space exploration and resource extraction. Before the break, we were talking about, all these private companies jumping into space. SpaceX, Blue Origin, Planetary Resources. It's really changing the game.
Yeah, it's exciting, but, also a bit of a Wild West situation up there. We were talking about the potential for conflict, right? Especially with the current legal framework. Well, let's just say it has some limitations.
Right, that 1967 Outer Space Treaty. A bit outdated, isn't it? Like
Yeah.
trying to apply rules from the days of black and white TV to the world of streaming services and virtual reality.
It's a good analogy. The treaty was a landmark achievement back then, no doubt. But it didn't exactly foresee the kind of commercial activity we're seeing now, let alone the potential for, space weapons.
So how do we even begin to fix this? Do we just need to, rewrite the whole treaty from scratch?
Rewriting the whole thing would be great, but, getting everyone on board, that's a tall order.
Yeah.
A more realistic approach might be to, develop some additional agreements or codes of conduct, ones that address specific things. Resource extraction, debris mitigation, those kinds of things.
Okay, so more targeted rules. That makes sense. But who's going to enforce them? Are we going to have, a space police force out there making sure everyone's playing by the rules?
That's the million-dollar question. And the answer, I think, lies in international cooperation. We need ways to monitor what's going on, resolve disputes, maybe even impose sanctions if someone's really breaking the rules, maybe a dedicated international body for space governance, or give existing organizations like the UN a bigger role.
It sounds like we're talking about building a whole new system of global governance, but for space. That's a pretty big task.
It is. But the alternative, just letting everyone do whatever they want, that's just asking for trouble. A Wild West scenario in space wouldn't benefit anyone in the long run.
I see your point. But let's shift gears for a minute. What about the role of public opinion in all of this? Do regular people have any say in what happens in space?
Oh, absolutely. Public awareness and engagement are crucial. The more people understand what's at stake, the more they can hold their leaders accountable. Push for responsible space policies.
So educating ourselves about these complex issues and making our voices heard. Got it.
And there's more people can do too. Support those organizations working towards space sustainability and international cooperation. There are tons of NGOs and think tanks doing great work.
Good to know there are people fighting the good fight for responsible space exploration. But let's go back to a point of tension we discussed earlier. The Artemis Accords. Those U.S.-led guidelines for lunar resource extraction. I think you mentioned some pushback from China and Russia.
Yeah, they're not exactly fans. They see the Artemis Accords as, basically a U.S. power grab, like America trying to control the moon and all those resources. They're worried the Accords aren't truly international, just favoring U.S. interests.
So that they see it as the U.S. trying to write the rules of the game to benefit themselves.
Basically. And they're worried about a two-tiered system where some countries get privileged access to lunar resources and others are left out in the cold. They're pushing for a more inclusive approach to lunar governance.
Sounds like a classic power struggle. But this time it's on the moon. A reminder that, even in space, we can't escape the complexities of geopolitics down here on Earth.
It all comes back to that, doesn't it? How do we reconcile those competing national interests with the need for a shared vision for space exploration? It's a tough question.
A tough question, for sure. But you mentioned open dialogue and finding common ground. Maybe that's a good place to start.
I think so. These challenges in space, they're global challenges. And they require global solutions. We have to start thinking as one planet if we want to have a future in space.
Right. It's not about us versus them anymore. It's about all of us working together. But speaking of working together, what about the practical side of things? All this traffic in space. We talked about space junk, but as more and more countries and companies launch stuff up there, aren't we just increasing the risk of collisions? It seems like a recipe for disaster.
It's definitely a concern. We need better systems for managing space traffic. Like air traffic control, but for space, to avoid those collisions and keep everything running smoothly.
So it's not just about preventing countries from fighting each other in space. It's about preventing accidents that could create even more debris.
Right. It's a multifaceted problem that needs a comprehensive solution.
Okay, we've discussed a lot in this part. Agreements, enforcement, public opinion, space traffic control. It's clear that we need to figure these things out if we want a future in space. But before we wrap up, there's one more thing we need to talk about. The ethical side of all of this.
Ah, yes. That's an important point. As we go further into space, we have to think about the ethical implications of our actions. It's not just about what we can do, but what we should do.
So, what do we owe future generations? How do we make sure space exploration benefits everyone, not just a select few? How do we protect the environments of other planets and moons?
Big questions, and not easy ones to answer. We need a serious conversation about this. Scientists, policymakers, industry leaders, the public, everyone needs to be involved.
It almost sounds like we need a new kind of space race.
Yeah.
One where the goal isn't just technological advancement, but ethical and sustainable practices as well.
I like that. We need to shift our focus from competition to collaboration, from short-term gains to long-term sustainability. It's about the big picture.
Okay, this has been a really thought-provoking conversation. Let's take a moment to gather our thoughts, and when we come back, we'll wrap up this deep dive with some final reflections on the future of space exploration. And we're back for the final part of our deep dive, exploring, well, all the geopolitical stuff surrounding space exploration and resource extraction. We've talked about private companies like SpaceX, international agreements, space traffic, you name it.
Yeah, we've covered a lot. And we even touched on, those ethical questions that come up as we push further into space.
Right, because it's not just about technology and profits. It's about doing things the right way, making sure space exploration is sustainable and benefits everyone, not just a select few.
Exactly. And that brings us back to those big questions, the ones we need to really grapple with. What are our obligations to future generations? How do we ensure space exploration benefits all of humanity, not just a few? And how do we protect those pristine environments on other planets and moons?
Those are questions that, well, I guess philosophers have been thinking about for ages, but they're becoming more and more real as space exploration becomes, well, less science fiction and more like, actual reality.
It's true. And there aren't easy answers. This needs to be a conversation. We need scientists, policymakers, industry leaders, the public. Everyone's got to be involved in figuring this out.
It's like we need a different kind of space race, right?
Yeah.
One where the goal isn't just being first, but doing things ethically and sustainably.
I like that idea. A shift from competition to collaboration, from those short-term gains to thinking about the long game. It's about the big picture.
Okay, as we wrap up this deep dive, what are the big takeaways you want our listener to walk away with?
The biggest one is that space exploration, it's at a crossroads. The decisions we're making right now, today, will determine what happens with space exploration for, well, probably centuries to come.
Wow. It really puts things into perspective, doesn't it?
Yeah.
We're not just watching history happen, we're actually shaping it.
That's right. And it all starts with understanding what's going on, learning about all the complexities of space exploration, the good, the bad, and how we can make it sustainable for the future.
So for our listener who wants to learn more, who wants to get involved, where should they go? What resources would you recommend?
There are some amazing organizations doing great work in this area. The Secure World Foundation, they focus on, making sure space is sustainable and secure. Then there's the Space Generation Advisory Council. They get young professionals involved in the whole space policy discussion.
Those sound like great places to start. And of course, there are always books, articles, websites, so much information out there about space exploration, space policy, the future of humanity in space.
Yeah, more accessible than ever before. It's really up to each of us to, go out and find it, get involved in these conversations.
So to our listener, we say stay curious, stay engaged, and keep looking up at the stars. The future of space is in our hands.
Let's make it a future we can all be proud of.
And on that note, that's a wrap for this deep dive. Thanks for joining us on this incredible journey of exploration and discovery.